Um, Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our beautiful new Melbourne Holocaust Museum. Oops, sorry. My name's Ellie Brooks, and perhaps because of my position on the board as a director, together with my passion for photography, I have the privilege of welcoming you and introducing our speaker, Simon Holloway. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which Melbourne Holocaust Museum resides. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and uphold their continuing relationship to this land. Welcome here tonight, everyone, to our very precious survivors, our visitors, our volunteers and staff, to our brand new Melbourne Holocaust Museum. I'm so proud to be standing here looking at this inspirational facility and all that's been achieved from inception in 1984 to today. I've been involved here since 1999, about half life, so I figure I've got another half to go. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Simon Holloway. He's the new head of education here, and he came to Melbourne in late 2021 from Sydney. Simon's highly qualified and carries a wealth of teaching experience and working with Holocaust survivors. Previously, he was at the Jewish Sydney Museum and now here in Melbourne. He holds a PhD from the University of Sydney in Classical Hebrew and Biblical Studies, a Master's in Ancient History, and his research concerns the identification of allusions to biblical and rabbinical literature in documents produced in the Holocaust. More than qualified to speak tonight. What a fascinating topic, the eye of the beholder, photography in the Holocaust. I see photography as struggling with truth as a concept. We don't question whether a painting is real or a dance or music is real. But given the mechanical nature of photography, we know at least that an event has had to have happened for the image to have taken. That is, the photographer's got to at least go out, see the event, and take what's unfolded before him or her. But to what extent is it true? And how do we recognise the limitations of what the image reveals? So photography has the power really to upend truth. So tonight, please welcome Simon to tell us about the topic, the eye of the beholder, photography in the Holocaust. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellie, for such a warm introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming this evening. I have to be mindful of not going over time, and because we don't have a clock, and because my watch broke, if you see me periodically looking at my phone, it's not because there's someplace I'd rather be. I wanted to speak a little bit about this topic of photography during the Holocaust, which is something that I find personally quite fascinating. And just by way of an introduction, I just wanted to mention we often, I often hear people in various capacities speaking about the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And while I think every historical event is unique, certainly one respect in which the Holocaust is unique is in as much as a genocide, the degree to which it was documented. And one of the ways in which the Holocaust was so extensively documented is through the photographic record. And so by way of an introduction to what we're going to be looking at this evening, I wanted to situate this within the history of photography. Because the Holocaust, and World War II for that matter, coincided somewhat with a rather rapid upsurge in the popularity of personal photography, but personal photography wasn't something new. And even during the First World War, there were photographers who were stationed with military battalions, and they were using equipment like the device that you've seen a couple of times already this evening, this monster over here, the F-24 camera, or using appliances like my personal favorite, actually, the Thornton Pickard Mark III Hythe machine gun camera. Now, soldiers themselves during World War I were also able to take photographs. Obviously, they're not lugging around large and expensive equipment like this. The most popular personal camera was the Kodak Vest pocket camera. You can see it actually features its own little tripod as well. And these, in fact, were marketed directly to soldiers and marketed also directly to soldiers' families. Perhaps a little more sadly when one considers the ways in which they're advertising one soldier's boy being home soon and We know, of course, that things didn't necessarily always work out in that way. But when we look at photographs that were taken by soldiers during the First World War, we find that they all have certain things in common. This is a typical example, this one that we see over here. Individuals are posed for the purposes of this photo. In fact, they would be holding that pose for a few seconds so that there would be minimal blurring. Obviously, the nature of combat in the First World War, being trench warfare, was largely sedentary, so that also lent itself to the use of this type of photography, and you can't always notice necessarily whether something is taken with a large and expensive camera or whether it's taken with a pocket camera. I'll share with you just one more example, only because it's a personal favorite of mine, and this is a photo of soldiers celebrating Hanukkah on the Eastern Front in 1916. Now, personally, I tend to prefer the original photo like we see here to the colorized versions, but in this particular instance, I will share a colorized version with you because I think the color actually adds a tremendous amount of detail to the photograph, if only because you can so easily recognize the distinction between different uniforms. We have German soldiers here with the pith helmets. We have Austrian soldiers in the blue uniform. You can actually see that it's a German and an Austrian soldier who are together holding the menorah, perhaps as a statement of their camaraderie with one another. When we consider these sorts of photographs, we appreciate the fact that outside of this environment, if one wanted to take a moving scene, if one wanted to capture motion, these types of cameras were insufficient to the task. The real revolution happened towards the end of the 1920s, described here, in fact, in this advertisement for a Leica camera as a revolution. The shutter speed was now such that it was actually possible to take photos that were of scenes in motion. And the big competitor to the Leica camera during this period was the Contax. And these are both German brands. Both of these photos became very, very popular in Germany during the 1930s, and we see a massive increase during this time in the amount of personal photography that is being taken. Another German company, IHG, produced in 1934 an SLR. That means that what you see through the viewfinder is the same as the photograph that you were going to take. And in fact, a year later, they improved upon this model by better synchronizing the shutter with the flash bulb so that you could take better photos at night. Together with a range of lenses that were produced by Zeiss Econ at the end of the 1930s, the stage is now set. That which had previously been the province of professional photographers is now very much the domain of the amateur as well. It's now possible for a broader range of people to take photos, and we see a real boom in the photo industry. A lot of people actually buying cameras, taking photos for themselves, right in time, of course, for World War II. Now, the Nazis appreciated the importance of photography. They had a very strong marketing department, you might say. They had photographers. Hitler himself had his own personal photographer, and individuals like Franz Krieger, who not only followed members of the top brass, but also went together with the armed forces to the front line. Now, he's not taking confronting images. His job is not to take scenes of violence, to capture anything that might be confronting. He wants to take photos that demonstrate the general camaraderie of soldiers, that show that their generals are serious, forthright men, but that they're also down to earth. The same is not always the case so far as regular soldiers are concerned. Here we have a German soldier, Dieter Keller, who's holding in his hands a Leica camera. Now, Leica actually had a special contract with the German military. So they supplied cameras to the Air Force, to the Luftwaffe, that were specially engraved on the back, like we see over here, property of the Luftwaffe. And they also provided cameras for the Army, and for the Navy as well. This is one for the Army. You can see that it's been engraved here, which is Army. But you might also notice that the individual who owned this camera has engraved it themselves. It's not as nice a job as we see professionally done over here, but you might be able to make out on the right-hand side the SS runes, beneath which it says KB, which stands for Kriegsberichter, which is war correspondent. These were photographers who were stationed together with the SS. They took photos that could be used for a propaganda purpose. In fact, if we look in the pages of Der Stürmer was a monthly newspaper, viciously anti-Semitic, from 1940 onwards, we see a lot of photos of Jews in the East. So I'll give you a few just quick examples. Here is one from March of 1941, next to a photograph of how Americans dance. We have Jews from the general government of occupied Poland. The following year, in January of 1942, we have how Jews bedeck themselves when they pray. And the year after that, in May of 1943, we have Jewish culture, quote unquote, in the East. All of these photos, one might assume, were taken with Leica cameras. These are all taken with this most ubiquitous camera during the period by individuals who were stationed together with the SS. They too were not allowed to take photos of a violent or confronting nature. But the general ubiquity of these cameras, the fact that really everybody, more or less, has an ability to take a record of these events, leads to orders like this one. Some of you might have even seen this particular order before. This was issued by Major Max Montour shortly after he had become the commander of the Central Police Regiment and shortly prior to a massacre of Jews in Bialystok. And the relevant section of this order is at the end of paragraph 1. He says, and I quote, "I forbid photography and the admission of spectators to sites of execution. Executions and places of burial are not to be made public." He's not issuing this order to the SS. He's certainly not issuing this order to the army. And he's not issuing this order to the police either. This order is actually issued to individuals like the ones that we see here. Don't be fooled by their fancy uniforms. These are not policemen. They are not, in fact, in this particular photograph, even members of the Nazi Party. Some people here may have heard of the individuals who are here being photographed. They were known as a reserve police battalion. These were volunteers, in this instance, volunteers from the city of Hamburg. In this particular instance, not just from the city of Hamburg, they formed what came to be known as Reserve Police Battalion 101. There are a few other photographs from this particular series, but I want to ask you, if anybody here can tell me, what exactly are they doing? They are drinking. They are singing. What are they celebrating? It's not a massacre. Say that again? Christmas. Fantastic. So in this particular instance, we not only know who is taking the photograph, we not only happen to know where the photograph is being taken, but importantly, we know when. And the when gives us the why. All of these pieces of information, when it comes to interpreting a photograph, are critical. If we want to understand really what it is a photo of, what exactly are the individuals in the photograph doing, and why is the picture being taken, we need to know who is taking the photo, who are they taking this photo of, who are these individuals, where are they taking the photo, and in this particular instance, when are they taking this photograph. Now, these men were stationed in Lodz in the end of 1940, and the reason that they were stationed in Lodz was to guard the perimeter of the ghetto. Now, many of these individuals had never previously left Germany, so they all, or almost all of them, had cameras. They took photos not just of themselves and not just of other people that they were meeting, but they also took landscape photographs like this one. Here we see the guarding of the perimeter of the Lodz ghetto at the end of 1940. The person taking the photograph is either standing on the roof of a low building or is looking through the window of a higher building. And it's kind of, I think, an eerie photograph, because aside from the visible presence of two other uniformed officers who were also guarding the perimeter, nobody else is to be seen. But there's a lot of people living in Lodz. They're just not out in the street. Another photograph, perhaps taken by the same photographer, is the one that I used as my title slide. And I chose this photo and am struck by this photo because it's quite evident that the individual who took it had a certain aesthetic sensibility. I think it's a good photograph. I think it's quite, from a compositional perspective, I think it captures a mood. It says something about the photographer and the photographer's sense of beauty. And so it's perhaps striking that individuals within this battalion were able to take not only photographs like this, but photographs like this one. This one is undated. Based on the subject matter, we can assume that it's 42 to 44. That's quite a large period of time. We can't really narrow it down any further than that. But I want to ask you, looking at this photograph, and we have the advantage of being able to see it on a large screen. It's a little bit more difficult when looking at a smaller screen. But looking at this photograph, if anybody can tell me, what is it a photograph of? Play acting. Give me more information. Why do you say play acting?
It's demonstrating what they're going to do to the Jew, what they've done to the Jew.
Okay, fantastic. So they're demonstrating either what they're going to do to the Jew or what they have done to the Jew. Forgive me for asking what is no doubt an obvious question. How do we know, however, that it's play acting? Yeah. This person who's standing in the middle is not sporting an actual beard, but is wearing a fake beard. In fact, in some respect, he is demonstrating what they think of Jews. Okay, by dressing up in this fashion, they're able to make a statement as to how do they see Jewish people. Okay, his sort of somewhat pathetically servile posture, the raising of his shoulders, the obsequious look on his face, together with the beard, the hat that he is wearing, this cap that is on his head, the smock, the basket with rags inside it. And you can see that the other men who are standing around him, who are members of the same battalion of which he is a part, are amused at this scenario. To all intents and purposes, this is the kind of thing that they are doing by day, here being parodied potentially by night. We can note as well that this is an indoor scene. We can't, just as we can't date it, we can't say precisely where this photograph is taken either, but they seem to be indoors. There's wiring behind them, almost looks a little bit like a police locker, and you can actually make out there's a firearm there in the back, and you can see the I've just lost the word that I'm looking for, the blade at the end of that firearm, the bayonet, thank you, protruding there behind one of these men's helmets. But as you pointed out, they're play acting. I want to show you a real photograph. I want to show you a photograph of an actual event, similar to the one that we see depicted here. And this is the only atrocity photograph that I am going to show you tonight. And I do consider this to be an atrocity photograph. This one is taken in Tomaszów Mazowiecki, which is near the city of Lodz, and it's taken at the end of 1939. Again, just for the purposes of speaking it out. Maybe speaking out the obvious, but what do we see here? Humiliation. How is this person being humiliated? They're cutting his beard. Okay. If we wanted to list all of the different things about this that make it humiliating, there is the fact that his beard is being cut. What else is it that makes this a humiliating event? The amount of people are laughing. Now this is near Lodz. Lodz is in a western part of Poland that was known as the Vaterland. There was a large German-speaking population there. They were a minority, but they were somewhat sizable. And this was an area of Poland that became annexed to Germany. And that German-speaking population was referred to as Volksdeutsche. They were ethnic Germans. Given the location of this photograph, we might be able to assume that the civilians who are standing around laughing are Volksdeutsche. Okay, they're not Poles. They consider themselves to be ethnic Germans. They have been, over the 1930s, becoming increasingly Nazified, and here they are somewhat entertained by this atrocious spectacle in which this man is having his beard cut. Who's cutting his beard? Say that again? Another Jew. How do we know that he is Jewish? In this particular instance, you can notice that he has tzitzit, protruding from underneath his vest. So again, if we wanted to list the various ways in which this is a humiliating spectacle, there is the public nature of it, the fact that it is his beard that is being cut, the fact that there is another Jew who is responsible for cutting his beard, and one more thing. What else makes this humiliating? Okay. If we're thinking about this as a public spectacle, there are younger people who are present as well. Okay. So it's a varied crowd. This is a slice of local life coming together to observe this particular event. There's something else. Thank you. The fact that it is a photograph. We oftentimes forget this when we look at photographs, and it's really important whenever we're engaging in sources of this nature that we take a moment to remember the nature of the source, to think that this is a photograph, that there is a person who is positioned roughly where we find ourselves when engaging with the photo. The reason that I don't want to show too many photos of this nature, and the reason why, while I feel they certainly have a place within a museum, the reason why I'm very hesitant to use them in an education program is because it is an atrocity picture. This person here, or indeed these two people here, who are both of them being humiliated in different ways, did not consent to have their photograph taken. They did not consent to have their photograph shared. But not only that, we don't know who they are. We can't name them, and that's deliberate. The anonymity is a part of what is transpiring because their identity was irrelevant to those who were persecuting them. They represent something. We are looking at these men through the perpetrator's gaze, and in so doing, we are, like it or not, situated together with the other onlookers. Okay? The young man there at the back who is gazing at the photographer with a conspiratorial grin in his face might as well be looking at us. Okay, he identifies with that person who is taking the photo, and we are forced into a position of his identifying with us as well, of making eye contact with him, rather than with this individual who is lowering his eyes to the ground. Now that's an interesting observation. So the man who is cutting his beard may have already been through this before by virtue of the fact that he is clean shaven. It's a possibility, but we can't know for certain. So a lot of people at this time, and today as well, might not sport a beard, but might nonetheless identify with a community where many men do grow beards. And growing a beard in some communities can be a mark of status. It could concern occupation, if a person is a professional rabbi, for example, for a community. I would be hesitant to draw those sorts of conclusions necessarily, but it's worth noting all of those different sorts of details about a photo. But in as much as we have here a situation in which a Jewish man is forced to perpetrate an act of humiliation against another Jewish man, well, these sorts of images, they are par for the course. Okay? And I share this one with you. This one is not taken in Lodge, or near Lodge. This one is actually taken within Warsaw, and you can tell even looking at the photograph, if not that it's in Warsaw, that it's within the general government of occupied Poland because they're wearing armbands. Okay, and here we have an armband of a Jewish policeman, so-called, and he is arresting, or in some sense manhandling, another Jewish fellow. And again we see onlookers in the background. I wonder if there's anything else about this photo that people might notice. Yes, thank you very much. So over here on the left-hand side of the picture, you will notice there is somebody filming the scene. This is actually not a photograph that I'm showing you here. It is a still from a film unfinished. Okay, this was the release of a propaganda film that the Germans had been making in the Warsaw Ghetto. And I only share this particular photograph with you to further highlight the point that it is absolutely critical when interpreting a photo to know who took it. We cannot infer the intentions behind the photo unless we know something of who the photo was taken by. And just one more image, just to make this particular point. I'll share this photograph with you. This is from 1940. This is how Yad Vashem describes this photograph. October 1940, Jews at prayer on Yom Kippur in Krakow, Poland. Consider, if you will, how much our interpretation of this photograph changes depending on whether it is a photograph taken by a Jew or somebody sympathetic to Jews, or a photograph taken by a German. Whether we see this as an act of spirituality, or whether we see it as an act of propaganda and cruelty. Given the fact that it is supposedly on Yom Kippur that this photograph is taken, might mean that we would lean in our interpretation to the photograph having been taken by somebody who is not Jewish, though we can never know for certain. For our purposes this evening, I would like, at least for the moment, to focus on photographs that were taken by Jews, those that we know were taken by Jews, and I want to specifically share with you some photographs taken by these two individuals, Henrik Ross and Mendel Grossman. Grossman was murdered on a death march in 1945, but both Grossman and Ross were survived by a large number of photographs that they covertly took within the Lodz ghetto. Both of them were in a privileged position in as much as both men worked for the Judenrat, for the Jewish Council, as photographers. So they had to take photos for people's work permits, for example, and they both found ways of taking other photographs as well. Here's a remarkable photograph by Henrik Ross that he titled Ghetto Policeman's Family. It's quite unlike other photographs from the period that we might normally see, and I think for that reason is all the more important. A lot of people oftentimes wonder, what is it that drove an individual to be a part of this Jewish order service that we refer to as the Jewish police within the ghettos? And I think this photograph rather beautifully captures that. One gets a sense as to what this individual in the uniform is working for, the people that he is seeking to save. Henrik Ross actually took a number of different photographs of Jewish police within the ghetto, but some of the photographs that he took of them are like this one here. And based on the composition of this photograph, are there any conclusions that we might be able to draw? It's surreptitious. So unlike the previous one, even though the subjects in the previous one gave no overt sign of knowing that they're being photographed, there are others where they do. Unlike that photograph, here one gets the sense that he is taking this picture covertly. He's not taking a picture of these individuals so much as he is taking a picture of an event. The previous photo, which was somewhat humanizing, that showed one individual together, the focus being on him in the uniform together with his wife, together with their baby, the focus now is on this a mass of uniformed individuals preparing to deport residents. Here is a photo taken by Mendel Grossman during one of the deportations. You may indeed have seen this particular photograph before. It's not dated. Given that this is from Lodz, we can perhaps assume that the destination of her deportation was Chelmno. Until 1944, every deportation from Lodz went to Chelmno. 1944, the first wave of deportations are to Chelmno, and subsequently they are to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And here she is hastily writing a letter. Now, it's worth noting that, again, there's no indication as to her name. She is anonymous, but the anonymity is different to the anonymity of a man who is having his beard shorn in public. Okay, she is anonymous through no fault of the photographer. Despite her anonymity, he is seeking to record her to some degree for posterity. And the same thing when we consider these photos also taken by Mendel Grossman. I'll show you another one in the same series. This can be dated. We know that this photograph was in September 1942. It was part of what the Germans called Aktion Gersperre. It was a major deportation following on from a big speech that was given by Mordechai Chaim Ramkowski, who was the head of the Judenrat, the famous Give Me Your Children speech, after which they deported all of the children within the ghetto who were below a certain age, together with the elderly and those who were sick. All of them were sent to Chelmno. Because Mendel Grossman worked for the Judenrat, he was sufficiently privileged as to be able to enter the prison where people were stored, where they were housed before being deported. So this photograph is taken from the inside of this prison complex. The individuals who are farewelling this young boy are on the outside. Okay, and again, there's a real pathos to this photo. And you can see, I think, compositionally, that he's bringing himself down to the level of the subject of the photograph and allowing us that opportunity and allowing future generations, really, that opportunity of engaging somewhat with the sentiment that is here being expressed. And I'll share just one more photo with you that's taken from that same series, and this is taken from the other side of the fence. Here we get, even though their feet are stationary, we get that sense of movement, that sense of flow in the direction of the railway station from which they will be deported. And the photo is actually of sufficiently high definition that it permits us to zoom in. And in so doing, one sees the distinction between every individual face. And I think it's interesting that his intentions here are of recording something for posterity, of preserving something as to who these individuals are, but their identities will be forever lost. Unlike adults in these photographs, where oftentimes, certainly not always, but oftentimes sufficient research might yield a clue as to an individual's identity, give us something that we can hang on to as regards who they might have been. When it comes to children, many of these children were actually from the orphanage within Lodge. There is no amount of research that will reclaim them. But his photographs, as an act of resistance, perhaps, as an act of memorialization, seek to preserve something about their subject. Now, it's odd that from a purely compositional perspective, there's not much difference between a photograph like this and a photograph like this. This is one of the many photographs in the Auschwitz album. But the intention of the photographers could not possibly be more different. In this instance, as with all of the photos taken in the Auschwitz album, the photographer is a member of the SS. His intention is not to record for posterity these people, the subject of his photograph, the identities of these individuals. His intention is to record, if not for posterity, at least for his superiors, the process. Okay, it's all about demonstrating the process, the success of the final solution. In this particular instance, all of the individuals photographed here, they are coming, I believe, from the Berehovo ghetto. This was at this stage, as part of Hungary. And the irony is, although his intention is not to record their identities, because there were other survivors who recognized relatives and friends within this album, unlike those photos from Lodge, there are a number of people here whose names we do know. Now, it's not just the SS who are seeking to take photographs that record the process here being depicted, but they also sometimes suborn Jews to that particular task as well. And I'll share one particular example with you. A man whom some of you might be familiar with is Rudolf Breslauer. He was a German Jew, a German Jewish photographer, fled together with his family to the Netherlands, but subsequent to the occupation of the Netherlands was deported with his family to Westerbork transit camp and was deported from there to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where he was murdered. One of his children survived. The rest of his family were also murdered in Auschwitz. But one of his children survived, and he was also survived by all of the photographs that he took in Westerbork transit camp. Now, these are photographs that, for the most part, we'll see a big exception a little later, but for the most part, he is taking for the Germans in the camp. Okay, for those who are running the camp, he is taking photos of those senior officials within the camp, and he is also taking photos that document the process by which people are being deported from the camp. And one of his most famous works is actually a film. And this image here, which has become a very famous image, is a still from that film. A part of that film will be played in our museum, will be played in a loop. And it's a footage of a train departing from Westerbork, a transit camp. The interesting thing about this instance is this young girl who is frightened and alone and gazing out of a window of the carriage became something of a symbol of the Holocaust, and her image has graced many books and pamphlets that relate to this particular history. But she has a name. She not only had a name, but she has a name, and she was identified in the 90s. Her name was actually Setela Steinbach, and she was not Jewish. She was a Sinti girl. And if not for an image of this nature, she would remain forever unknown to us. So although Rudolf Breslauer could not have known, and indeed may not have himself really taken much notice of this fine detail of his film, the work that he produced has allowed her to be returned to her identity, or her identity to be returned to her, and her to the historical record. This girl existed. But I'll share one other photo with you that he took. And you may have seen this particular photo before. I want to pause on this photo because I think it's quite a remarkable photo, and I think there is much that we can learn from it. And I want again to ask people here, in looking at this photograph of people readying themselves for deportation from Westerbork, if there's anything about this picture that you might notice. They don't look anxious. What is it about them that does not suggest anxiety? Yes, Mary. There are no soldiers. So what we see in this photograph, and this was important as well for those individuals who are asking him to take photos, to demonstrate the orderly nature of this of these proceedings. So we see that people are very, it's very orderly. They're arranged in a line. It's controlled, but it's not controlled by force. We don't see a whole range of different soldiers or men in uniform or people with firearms. There are plenty of events, plenty of deportations where those things transpired. But in this particular instance, it's quite orderly, and that suggests that they're not anxious. Okay, so we can actually see along the carriages over there. I can't use my a pointer, but you can see actually along there. So that there are sections of the carriage where there are. I think it's not so much windows as doors that are open. So the sidings of the carriage that are open. Though there are places, such as major metropolitan centres, places in Germany and in Western Europe, where they would board regular passenger trains for the purposes of appearances. Might only be once they reached, in the case of Germany, the borders of the Reich, that they would need to disembark and change to another type of transport. But in this instance, we do see all of those, whether they're windows or sections that are open. What else do we see? They're well dressed. Now, that's interesting because it's not even so much that they are well-dressed, which they certainly are, they're inappropriately dressed. If we think about where they're going, they're all of them going to board a train that is going to take them to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Even were they able to keep their clothes, which they will not, the clothes that they are wearing are not appropriate for the place to which they are going. And so what can we infer from that? They don't know. Fantastic. And there are some other clues here that they don't know where they're going as well. Say that again? They're chatting. If we look at their body language, people seem kind of hopeful. They're going on a trip. Now, they're not delighted in this circumstance, and they appreciate the fact that they do not want to go on this trip. If we're thinking about this in a broader historical context, there are many people who in the Netherlands went into hiding when it became necessary for them to be deported. Certainly the most famous example of this is Anne Frank and the Frank family. When her sister Margot received a summons for deportation, they took that as their opportunity to go into hiding. They didn't know about the nature of the destination, but they knew they didn't want to go there. So the fact that they don't seem overtly anxious, we should not confuse for assuming that they might think that where they're going is truly benign. They appreciate that these exigent circumstances and they are under duress. But where there is life finds hope. And I think in terms of the fact that people are conversing with one another, in terms of the fact that we have a couple down at the right-hand side who seem to be sporting with a young girl, all of this bespeaks the fact that they are not aware that they are all of them about to become victims of violent crime. But there's one other very, very big detail as well. They are men and women together. There's a lot of luggage. They're taking stuff. Okay, now the Germans don't need them to take that stuff with them. They're leaving Westerbork. It's a transit camp. They'll take whatever they leave behind. It's part of this ruse. Okay, it's absolutely. Let me make this point to you with reference to something else. This is another photograph that Henrik Ross took. He also took a number of photos of flyers, notices that were on the walls within the camp. But in this particular instance, this is also a part of our collection. And so I can share with you a much clearer image of this. Those of you who facilitate education programs with students will be well familiar with this particular image. And for the benefit of anybody who is not familiar, let me just briefly tell you the story behind how we got this image. There were two young men in the Lodge ghetto, A.B. Goldberg and Bono Wiener, who made a pact with one another. They hid various items, forming a couple of small archives within the ghetto, and they promised one another that should either of them survive, they will recover those archives and use the contents of them to show the world what had transpired. Both of them survived. Unfortunately, only one of the archives they were able to recover. Bono, of course, is one of the founders of this museum. AB still speaks to students, and we honor their legacy as well by using this particular document with students. Okay, we have a replica of this object that we show students, and I want to take you through what this says. Okay, so let's just take a moment to consider the translation. We are told that it is announcement number 417. By order of the Oberbürgermeister, which is the mayor, the ghetto must be moved to a new location. Workers will travel together with their families to perform labor, the first transport departing at this time, and 5,000 people moved daily. We're given luggage requirements and told that the family members of those employed in these workshops are included in the transport to avoid the separation of families. Workshops departing after those two that were listed above will be notified separately, and that those departing must report to temporary housing in the barracks of the Radogosh train station. There are other orders of this nature, by the way, that stipulate that if you don't go, if you are late, if we have to come and get you, we'll waive that luggage requirement and you won't be able to bring anything with you when you go. Okay, if we think sort of psychologically the impact that this has, we're told information as regards the date and the time of the transport, and it's signed Mordechai Chaim Ramkovsky. Okay, it's an official document. But I want to go back to just one particular part of this, and it's this section here. To just take a moment, as we do with students when they engage with this object as part of our handling collection here at the museum, to think about the ways, some of which I think are quite subtle, that they convey to those deportees what they want them to know. So just to take these really one at a time, and rather than kind of crowdsourcing, I'll point out to you, we're told that people will travel together with their families in order to perform labor. Okay, it's stipulated quite clearly. We're told, of course, that a person is allowed to bring with them a certain amount of luggage. Can't take everything, but there is a certain quantity of things that you can take with you, and people might get recommended to them to take materials that you can eat with, and a change of clothes, and a certain amount of currency, and so forth. And finally, we are told that family members are included in the transport, even though they only want workers, but specifically to avoid the separation of families. It's subtle, and it's quite cruel, and it's across the board. So we see it testified to in that photograph from Westerbork. We see it also in photographs from Lodge. Okay, this is another one taken by Henrik Ross of a deportation. You can see in this particular instance, there's a member of the so-called Jewish police who is assisting somebody with their luggage. And he too might not actually know the nature of the destination. Those rumors persisted even after the deportees had left. Okay, even when we might assume people had every reason to know they don't want little children as workers, the elderly, the sick, what kind of work are they performing? Nonetheless, again, where there is life, life finds a way to hope. Now, I mentioned AB and Bono and the remarkable archives that they hid. There was a larger archive within the Lodge ghetto that was preserved by the Judenrat. And it was recovered. Here is a photograph of the recovery of some of this archive shortly after the war. So there was three lots to the archive. The first lot was recovered immediately after the war. This is a photograph of the recovery of the second part of the archive in October or November in 1946, and there was a third part that was recovered subsequently to that. And the contents of this archive, not in their entirety, but to a large degree, were published in 1984 by Lucian Dobroszycki as the Chronicle of the Lodz Ghetto, which I believe we actually have in our museum library. And one of these documents, dated July 25th, 1944, records by a member of the Judenrat that the ghetto has received its first messages from people who left to perform manual labor outside the ghetto in the recent resettlement. 31 postcards have arrived, all of them postmarked July 19, 1944. Fortunately, it is apparent from these cards that the people are faring well, and what is more, that the families have stayed together. It appears to be confirmed that labour brigades are truly required in the old Reich. Okay, Lodz is part of the Reich, having been annexed to Nazi Germany, but within the old Reich, within Germany proper, they truly do require the services of these people. I apologize for the awful nature of what I am about to tell you, but it was a custom, not uniformly practiced, but oftentimes practiced in Chełmno, and also in Sobibor, that individuals who were on those transports were removed from those transports and made to write postcards that would be addressed by the person who was writing them and kept by individuals working within the camp until a later date when they would be sent. They would be receiving these postcards weeks after the person who had written the postcard had been murdered. And we ourselves, when encountering this, might marvel at how they believed it. Granted, Lodz was a very isolated ghetto, but even in Lodz, even as late as 1944, is it really possible that they didn't actually know? But you want to believe. And I actually think rather than that's being a statement of human frailty, I think it says something very, very powerful about the nature of resistance. People find a way to hope. Rather than succumbing to despair, people find that which they can rely upon. And because I would like to end this today on a spirit of resistance and resilience and hope, I want to share with you a photograph that was taken within the Westerbork transit camp, but not at the bidding of the officers who ran the camp. And given that I commenced this evening with the Chanukah photograph taken in 1916, and given that I should add that it is now Rosh Chodesh Kislev, so in fact as the stars come out, it is now the first day of the month of Kislev, so in a little bit more than 3 weeks we will have the festival of Chanukah. It seems fitting to also end with the Chanukah photograph tonight. Rudolf Breslauer took this photograph on the 28th of December in 1943. There's a lot of people in the photograph. One of them we can actually identify. He survived Leo Blumenson, so he died in 1993, and he's the young man who is assisting with the lighting of the candles over here. And he worked within Westerbork as a youth leader, so he assisted running programs for youth who were within this particular camp. I cannot tell you what happened to other people within this photograph. We can only imagine, based on the law of probability, what would have transpired for most of the people who are here recorded for posterity. But the recording of this photograph itself, as with so many others that we have seen tonight, is itself an act of resistance. And all the more significant that what it is recording is an act of significance. On Hanukkah, of course, we have a festival all about resistance, all about that concept of light triumphing over darkness. And although in this instance the darkness truly was impenetrable, I think one of the things that these photographs give us is a little bit of a glimpse into the nature of those communities that were lost, the strength that they had, the courage that they demonstrated, the faith that they possessed, whether in their own traditions or whether in their own possibilities of survival, as something that has, thanks to the incredible work of many of these photographers, survived those people. I would like to make an announcement, actually, before we do finish up, which is just to the effect that for anybody who might be interested, we are going to be running a course here next year, a Holocaust education course that runs for 9 consecutive weeks, that will be presented by me, together with the wonderful Sue Hampel. But otherwise, I want to thank you again very much for coming out this evening, and I hope to see you again. Thank you.